So, welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi, and I'll serve as the host today. Thanks to everybody for joining us here in Rubenstein 414. And thanks to our friends, alumni, and colleagues joining us on Zoom. We're thrilled to have with us today Rachel Morello-Frosch for her talk, Solutions-Based Science to Address the Climate Gap. Rachel has been with us here at Harvard over the course of this academic year as a Radcliffe-Salata Climate Justice Fellow. Rachel is a professor at the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley. She's a member of the National Academy of Medicine. Her research examines structural determinants of environmental health and understanding how co-exposures to chemical and non-chemical stressors drive health inequities. During the Biden administration, Rachel served on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. She has a new job starting in July as the inaugural Associate Provost of Energy, Climate, and the Environment at UC Berkeley. And I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to serve on the board to the Switzer Foundation with Rachel for a number of years. Rachel, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Thumbs up, great. Thank you for hosting me. It's been dreamy to be here as a Radcliffe-Salata Climate Justice Fellow here at Harvard, and I was really pleased to be invited to talk to the seminar. So I want to talk a little bit about work that I've been doing with the collaborators across the country, trying to think about how we address in our analyses equity related issues in terms of climate change, in terms of analyses, in terms of its impact, but then also starting to understand some of the short-term benefits of climate policies and also their potential health equity benefits. So I would be remiss if I didn't propose a framework for how we think about this term that we call the climate gap, and what are the historical drivers of the current situation that we see in terms of the disproportionate impact of climate change on marginalized communities. And this often we analyze sort of what's going on today, and it's important to sort of have that legacy and historical understanding of those drivers and the extent to which discrimination and land use policies that are structured in discrimination and structural racism, whether that's discrimination in the real estate and lending industries, redlining on dispossession of indigenous communities from land, leads to what we currently see now in terms of racial residential segregation, wealth and income inequality, and even more importantly, inequalities in political power that have enabled the creation of what we see now as sacrifice zones, where we see the disproportionate siting of industrial facilities, including energy facilities or oil and gas extraction activities in marginalized communities. And the importance of understanding that more privileged communities benefit from this arrangement, both as producers of these industrial sources and also avoid, but also as consumers, the way in which we participate in the stock market, things like that. And there's been regional inequalities in terms of regulation of these facilities. And in many cases, these sacrifice zones have dealt with regulatory abandonment for decades. And this leads to disparities in exposures to fossil fuel related air pollution in the short term, higher pollution levels overall in places that are more highly segregated, often in part because in more segregated urban areas, for example, people have to drive longer distances to access their work, basic services. That can degrade air quality and in a regional basis for everyone, even though within those regions there are inequities in exposures. And then this can also lead to what we call the climate gap in terms of race and class-based disparities in the effects of climate change, whether that's heat, extreme precipitation, drought, wildfire, housing loss, sea level rise, and displacement. And picture says 1,000 words. People are probably very familiar with this region of the country. This is so-called Louisiana's Cancer Alley, which stretches between Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and New Orleans. And this is what often people refer to as a petrochemical riskscape. On the right-hand side is an old map of the ways in which this land was divided. A lot of sugarcane was grown here for a very long time, it's still grown there. And a lot of slave labor was used to cultivate that land. And then it transitioned to a tenant farming operation situation after slavery was abolished. And many people that acquired land in this area now live next to these petrochemical facilities. So people whose ancestors worked this land as slaves are now often living near, proximate to these industrial and chemical facilities. And one of the things that is important to see now is we have a situation where racial segregation resulting from discriminatory land use policies, which has been documented a lot, so redlining is one example, leads to what we see, for example, in terms of patterns of racial residential segregation in urban communities of the United States. This is about 310 what we call metropolitan statistical areas, so cities and their surrounding suburbs, and the levels of segregation of, it's called the multi-group dissimilarity index. And basically what it measures is within a metropolitan area, what proportion of people would have to move from one census tract to another in order to achieve an even distribution of the different racial and ethnic groups that live in that area. So places in red are considered hyper-segregated, where more than 60% of people would have to relocate in order to achieve an even distribution. And then yellow is considered moderately segregated. And this is the result of both legacy policies, so people often point to what we call redlining. This was often, we point to the development the Homeowner Loan Corporation, so under the Roosevelt administration in the late 1930s, the federal government sought to address and prevent mortgage defaults in the wake of the Great Depression. That's a great thing, okay? But the challenge and the problem was that the implementation and the decisions about where to invest and help people from defaulting on their mortgages was based on a mapping approach to grade neighborhoods from A to D, D being worst, A being best. And the criteria for getting low grades of neighborhoods included criteria that were based on the racial and class makeup of the neighborhood. So here's an example of a neighborhood in LA that was redlined. And you can see the descriptions, I'm not going to read them to you, are very kind of racialized and racist. And this neighborhood was subsequently colored in red, i.e. the term redlining. I want to emphasize, though, that people often point to these maps as sort of the reason why we have segregation today. And I would like to reiterate that these maps merely reflected years and years and years and years of historical racist land use decision making before. It didn't just start with the creation of the Homeowner Loan Corporation. But these maps are very powerful. They've become digitized. Many of us have used them for myriad environmental analyses. So in terms of thinking about the energy sector in California and nationwide, there's been a lot of interest in the effects of oil and gas development and its effects on health. And I got into this work in part because in California, there was a lot of debate about the health effects of oil and gas development in a state where the oil and gas industry is well over 100 years old. We also have a lot of oil and gas wells, not just in rural areas, but also in cities, often very next to where people live, and schools, in part because the sector is so old. And no one had really looked at, everyone thought, well, California is different. We don't do that much fracking there, and so it's probably not as problematic. And so we decided to fill that data gap in California. I'll show you those results in a second. But the other thing is we have wanted to look at the extent to which historical redlining might be associated with the placement of oil and gas wells, and can we see kind of historical patterns? And so what I'm showing you here is this is looking at 33 US cities where we had access to homeowner loan corporation maps, okay? And also places where there were oil fields where you would be able to drill oil and gas wells for extraction. And here on the x-axis is the grade of the neighborhood, and this is the count of the wells. And so you can see that, not surprisingly, lower grades are associated with higher numbers of wells, which not surprising because one of the criteria for getting a D grade is the presence of a lot of industrial activity, okay, in addition to some of the racialized criteria. And when you look at wells before appraisal, you know, we looked at the neighborhoods that were graded D, but we wanted to see, you know, do we see this pattern before these maps were drawn? A little bit. But then what we see is that after appraisal and these maps are drawn, this is accelerated further, where that sort of, it feeds on itself, and you still see that gradation of wells, increased wells with lower grade. And we care about this because numerous studies, a lot of the early studies looking at, I do a lot of work on perinatal health effects of environmental hazard exposures. And again, we focused on California because this was, there was a bit of a data gap. A lot of that earlier work had focused in areas where there's been proliferation of hydraulic fracturing, so the Marcellus Shale, places in Texas. And California doesn't have as much fracking, really. But we have a lot of people, almost 8% of our population lives near an active oil and gas well. And subsequent studies, including ours, have shown definitely increased risks of adverse perinatal outcomes, whether we're talking about risk of a low birth weight birth, small for gestational age birth, a little more mixed evidence in terms of increased risk of preterm birth, but definitely elevated effects. And we did see slightly stronger effects for people who were living near fracked wells in California. And we did see some stronger effects among Latinx pregnant mothers, particularly for preterm birth. A lot of this evidence that we generated and that others have generated formed the basis for the passage of some legislation in California, SB 1137, which mandated better health protection, community health protections by the agency in California that regulates oil and gas extraction. Many of us across the country participated on a public health expert panel to distill and review all of the evidence that supported the passage of this, which one of which requires increased buffer zones for oil and gas development, stricter rules around renewing permits. This was fought very heavily by industry, and eventually it was allowed to be implemented. These are just to give you an idea of the effects that we saw for oil and gas extraction in California. We saw so the strongest effects in terms of the odds of a low birth weight birth, and also decreased term birth weight on the right. We saw the strongest effects for pregnancies among mothers that were living in rural areas. So stronger, higher risk of low birth weight, and pretty dramatic decreases in term birth weight, particularly for folks in rural areas. And we did see a dose-response relationship. So I want to switch gears a little bit to thinking about climate policy and energy and the ways in which we can leverage data that we have to answer some key questions. And right now, it's getting a little bit harder to answer these questions due to funding restrictions. We've had our funding cut off and then reinstated due to lawsuits filed by our colleagues in the law school at Berkeley that helped us get some of our funding reinstated UC-wide, for which I'm very grateful. So I'm going to show you some examples, some of which are kind of epidemiologically oriented studies, leveraging administrative data sets. And then the second one is developing analyses that are more forward-thinking and projecting to inform strategies for equitable climate resilience in communities. And this is an important environmental justice question. There are a lot of environmental justice organizations across the country, particularly in low-lying coastal areas, but that are really trying to do community resilience planning to help fortify communities from the effects of climate change. And so they have been seeking to marshal scientific resources with projections that can inform their strategies in the future. So the first example I want to talk about is actually a study that we did a little while ago. And this is the brainchild of a current colleague of mine who was then a postdoc with me, Joan Casey at University of Washington. So as people here probably already know, in California, we passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, and then we renewed it. So AB 32 was passed in 2006, and then we subsequently renewed it as SB 32. And we started to think, well, this law has been in play for a while. Could we maybe think about can we document some of the short-term health benefits of this law, or at least in the run-up to the law? And so we started thinking, well, one of the things that happened in California in the run-up to the law was that oil and power plants, companies were starting to retire power plants because even though the law, when these retirements happened, hadn't passed, power companies were starting to see the writing on the wall. They were probably going to have to pay for something they used to be able to do for free, emitting greenhouse gases, because they were either going to have some kind of carbon tax, or it was going to be some kind of cap and trade system. California settled on a cap and trade system. And so some of these facilities, the writing was on the wall, they weren't going to be very efficient and profitable. And so they started to wind them down. And so there were 8 oil and coal power plant retirements over a period of 10 years. And so we thought, maybe we can use administrative data to assess the extent to which we might see some short-term health benefits in the wake of these power plant closures. Because a lot of the conversations about climate change and its costs, focus on, well, we're focusing on protecting future generations. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the short-term benefits often don't get incorporated into those conversations when we're trying to think about the benefits of these policies. So we first, used existing monitoring data, which is a little bit of a crude way to look at this at the time, but we looked at what did we see in terms of declines in PM 2.5 pre and post retirement. And on the sex axis, this is looking at air quality levels within 5-kilometer buffer distance from retired plants, 5 to 10, and then 10 to 20. And we do see suggestions that air quality improved in the post-retirement era, as you can see by the decline in the green. But the real question was, could we potentially see effects on decreases in rates of preterm birth? And we used birth certificate data over a very long period of time during this retirement period. So we had a lot of sample size to burn. And in a nutshell, what we saw was that the retirements were associated with about a 2% reduction in preterm birth rates overall. So this is looking at the overall reductions. The red lines represent the rates in areas that were less than 5 kilometers from the plant. And then the orange areas are between 5 and 10 kilometers. And the comparator group is beyond 10 and 20 kilometers. And then what we also see here that I want to draw your attention to, and the biggest effect was for late preterm birth. We didn't really see any association for very early preterm birth. But an interesting result here was that we saw that when we stratified by self-identified race of the mother, we saw some suggestive evidence that the benefits were stronger for Asian and Black mothers, although these results, these confidence intervals are quite wide and not statistically significant. but it does suggest um, potential health equity benefits with the retirement of these power plants. And I can say, 2% is a lot when you consider how many births we have in California. I think if I were to invent a drug that reduced preterm birth by 2%, people would view that as an effective intervention. We're starting to look at using a similar approach at California refinery retirements and perinatal outcomes. This is kind of work in progress right now. We're looking at 4 refinery retirements. So there's refineries are starting to retire, and then sometimes they're retiring and there's a long pause, and then they're going to start refining biofuels. But we wanted to see whether or not we can assess potential short-term health benefits of these refinery retirements. And here, the evidence is a little bit more mixed. These results are still preliminary. So these are the 4 refineries that we examined, and then we looked at in terms of preterm birth, term low birth weight, and small for gestational age births. And for a lot of these, like for preterm birth, we didn't really see any significant effects. And here it's a little bit more of a mixed bag, although we saw a stronger effect for this along Bakersfield refinery, both in terms of reduced term birth weight and reduced odds of small for gestational age births. The Marathon Martinez refinery, which is in Richmond, California, we struggled with this one because this refinery retired right around the time that we all had to go into isolation mode related to the pandemic. So there's a lot of data noise during that time, and we've been really struggling with that, because the other thing that we know is that before vaccinations became ubiquitous and people had already undergone infection, contracting COVID during pregnancy does increase the risk of preterm birth if you haven't been vaccinated. So we're still struggling. These results are preliminary. Stay tuned. Okay. So the second example I want to give is a more recent project where environmental justice organizations have really wanted to marshal scientific resources to try and address some of the slower moving threats related to climate change, including sea level rise. And so we were able to get US EPA funding to undertake this project in collaboration with a bunch of public health advocacy groups, as well as environmental justice organizations. We got also money from the California Strategic Growth Council to help us do this first in California. I'm going to show you the most recent results for the country. So obviously the motivation is that sea level rise is accelerating, and coastal areas are at big, huge risk. And there's concerns, EJ advocates have been concerned about a lot of things, but the ones that we've been addressing are threats to housing in low-lying areas, particularly for those of us who live in the San Francisco Bay Area, where we have housing crisis. And then also potential threats to low-lying hazardous facilities that either use, process, or store toxic compounds, and that are at risk of contaminant releases due to sea level rise and other events. So this is our science team, and my collaborators include Lara Cushing from UCLA and colleagues from Climate Central that do a lot of the sea level rise projections, and then a colleague from China and some our students who've been instrumental. And then these are environmental justice and public health collaborating organizations. So this really is kind of a super duper collaborative project, both in terms of developing the paper and then also the tool that I'm about to show you. So the first analysis that we did was looking at potential threats to housing by state. And Climate Central was fortunate to get very good data from the National Housing Trust to enable us to geocode the location of these housing units and their physical extents to then estimate the extent to which they would experience a flood event with I'm showing you the worst case scenario for 2050. So on the right on the left side, you see a map of the expected number of units that are expected to be exposed to a flooding event. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the expected number of housing units that are exposed to a major flooding event at least 4 times a year. And then here, this is looking at the percentage of housing stock that is exposed to a flooding event. The green bars represent affordable housing, and the yellow bars represent general housing. So we were able to kind of disaggregate that, which is, again, a significant equity question. And affordable housing was not only subsidized housing, but also natural market, affordable housing as well. And then the second analysis that we undertook was looking at sea level rise and flooding threats to hazardous industrial sites. Tons and tons of studies looking at different kinds of hazardous facilities, whether those are from the toxic release inventory, concentrated animal feeding operations, treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, power plants, other kinds of things have shown that these types of facilities tend to be disproportionately located in poor communities and communities of color. Prior to some of this work, most of it of sea level rise related research is focused on property damage and costs, which is very important. But we really wanted to look at, can we get a better handle on what's the intersection of sea level rise, threats to hazardous sites, and what that means for environmental justice communities in terms of informing their efforts to develop resilient strategies. So we sought to undertake the first national assessment of sea level rise related flooding risk in the United States and assess the extent to which marginalized populations are more likely to live at at-risk sites, and then develop a tool, in addition to publishing a paper, develop a tool with visualizations online that can be useful to communities and decision makers across the country. So we spent a long time doing a lot of data wrangling, using myriad data sources to geocode the location and the physical extent of about 48,000 coastal sites that emit, use, or store hazardous materials. And we classified facilities into categories using their NAICS codes. And then we estimated the extent of the facility, so not just having like a dot on a map, but actually what's the extent of the property where we had access to tax parcel data. And we define communities at risk as our unit of analysis focused on low-lying census block groups. And those block groups would be considered exposed if they contained residents in the area within 1 kilometer of a site that was at risk of a 1 in 100 year of flooding event that would cover at least 25% of the site. And we had different kinds of metrics. We had tracts that were at risk, so they had at least one at-risk facility, total number of at-risk sites, and then the sum of what we call total annual exposure, EAE, across all at-risk sites. I'm going to show you just the results for number 1. And then we did area level indicators of social marginalization at the block group level to assess our environmental justice questions using American Community Survey and voter turnout data, and the Biden administration's climate and economic justice screening tool as indicators. So here are the results. In a nutshell, for 2050, of the 48,000 facilities that we were able to map, about 3,800 are at risk of a flooding event by 2050 under a high emissions scenario. And then in 2100, about 5,500 facilities are at risk. So this graph shows you the results for 2050. This side shows you the results for 2100. And then these color-coded things are the 11 categories of facilities that we analyzed. And so, for example, you can see for Louisiana, the biggest category in terms of at-risk sites, not surprisingly, is related to oil and gas wells, which are often located in very low-lying areas. And about 20% of coastal sewage treatment plants, refineries, and formerly used defense sites are at risk in the country. And 40% of fossil fuel ports and terminals are at risk. And Florida, New Jersey, California, Louisiana, and Texas have the most sites that are at risk. So those 7 states account for 80% of the at-risk sites. And so the good news is we could focus our efforts. Bad news is it's going to be hard for a variety of reasons that we could talk about later. And by 2100, we could avoid roughly 8% or 300 sites being at flood risk by stabilizing and then greatly reducing greenhouse gas emissions, if we compare it to an emission scenario RCP of 4.5. Okay, so then in terms of our equity analysis, this is looking at the likelihood of an at-risk site and the extent to which it's associated with the demographic characteristics of the block group. And so this top result here that you see, this is disadvantaged status of a block group as of a census tract in this case, as defined by the climate equity and the climate and economic justice screening tool. And so this shows that those with communities defined as disadvantaged have a 50% higher odds in disadvantaged communities of hosting an at-risk site using CGIST. And then we looked at other demographic indicators in terms of proportion of renters, non-voters, and you can see in the case of renters, there's a 41% higher odds and per standard deviation unit increase of proportion of renters of hosting an at-risk site. These are, again, the odds ratios that I just showed you in the figure on the left for 1 kilometer distance, and we did some sensitivity analysis expanding the buffer zone, and they're fairly consistent. So in conclusion, we found that there are about 5,500 hazardous sites that are threatened by a 1 in 100 year flood event by 2100 due to sea level rise. And the majority of these places are going to remain at risk even if greenhouse gases are reduced, but 7 states account for 80% of the projected risk. And we also showed that sea level rise flooding of hazardous sites is definitely more likely to impact marginalized populations as defined by civic engagement capacity, proportion renters, disadvantaged status as defined by the CGIST, et cetera. And again, these patterns could definitely change. We did a snapshot based on current demographics, and flood mitigation efforts and movement of people could change these patterns. And there's obviously a lot of uncertainties when you apply these types of screening analyses and projections. We may be over or underestimating the number of at-risk sites. We weren't able to include a lot of things like oil and gas pipelines, which we know are highly problematic because the data wasn't of decent enough quality for us to integrate that. And we focused on overland flooding related to sea level rise and coastal storms. But what we weren't able to account for was groundwater upwelling, which we know is a byproduct of sea level rise and a huge problem. We were able to do that in a separate analysis that we did very specifically for California. We published that a few years prior to this one because California did have some good data on projected groundwater upwelling associated with sea level rise. And, we assume a constant frequency in the magnitude of flood events into the future, and we may be overestimating our exposure in terms of extreme storm events combined with sea level rise. And so, this screening approach was designed to also elevate where are places at high risk And then where do we need to concentrate our efforts to really understand in a more site-specific way what those threats are to the communities nearby. California, as a result of some of our work in our earlier study in California, actually created funding to enable coastal communities that were highlighted in our California study to fund them to do more research and to figure out a mitigation plan. So finally, in addition to publishing a paper on this in November, we worked with Climate Central, our collaborators on this entire project, to develop a visualization tool of what we're calling our toxic tides project, where people can go on the map and they can zoom in, they can look at this data, they can have different emission scenarios, they can focus on demographic characteristics of interest to them. It's available in English and Spanish. And with the exception of the oil and gas wells, which is proprietary and we weren't able to share it, all the data is up there so people can download it and analyze it for themselves. And then Climate Central has also supplemented a lot of this work through a project that they call Flood Vision, which is last summer they spent time driving all the way from Maine through the Gulf of Mexico and Texas to take pictures of neighborhoods and also some of these major hazardous facilities, and then to create visualizations of what these places will look like under different climate change scenarios. And so some of that is integrated with our data visualization tool. Thanks to the great works of that project, we were able to really take advantage of that to supplement. So that's it, and I really look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Let me open with the first question, then I'll open it up to the audience for questions. Steve, welcome. When we think about flood risk, one thing that's come up when we've had some of these like really big flooding events recently, let's say Hurricane Harvey, which you mentioned here, there's a question on the residential side of, do I rebuild? Do I retreat? Do I decide to sell to someone else who redevelops and then decides to sell it to someone else? So there's different kinds of reactions to a very salient flooding event, like the really intense flooding we had after Harvey. And I'm curious, when you talk about some of these various toxic sites, many of which are in that are energy infrastructure, and looking out to 2100, I'm curious how one might think about not just what's the impact of sea level rise 75 years from now or 25 years from now, but perhaps a salient flooding event, a storm surge event, how that might inform the business decision. Do I harden and rebuild here? Do I say, I'm getting out of the business here, I'm going to sell to someone else who's going to take that risk and keep managing it? Do we retreat? Some of this is, if it's power generating technologies, we know we need power plants, maybe of different types than some of these that are at risk. But I'm curious how you and your team have thought about, because I'm sure this is a question that comes up. We're forecasting out this current slate of toxic sites 25 and 75 years out. How do you think about the opportunities or the challenges or perhaps the role of policy to inform how we might relocate some of these toxic sites out of these risky environments?
Yeah, great question without like a perfect answer because it's very site specific. I think one of the things that this project and this screening strategy has elevated, and it's been very useful for decision makers that have purview over these kinds of questions that you just posed. And it really depends on the kind of facility that's there. It has also sparked a lot of debate about, for example, we had a lot of cleanup sites and Superfund sites that we looked at, or formerly used defense sites. And some of those are in prime, quote unquote, prime real estate, like in the Bay Area, not surprisingly, because a lot of, these sites were developed because proximity to the water in the bay was key. And so it has sparked a lot of debates because there have been plans to develop housing, luxury housing on these sites. And now communities as well as city planners are having to revisit like whether this is a really good idea, and developers are starting to think, maybe we don't want to take that risk because like we'll develop this thing and then all of a sudden groundwater upwelling could create a toxic problem in this. So I don't have the perfect answer, but it definitely has influenced land use decision making. I would say a lot of the inquiries that we've had is around housing redevelopment, but then also with like power sector, like some of these oil and gas wells, so maybe we should like not renew their permits and shut them down. And then some of these power plants that are already reaching the end of their life, maybe we shouldn't be extending their life.
Let me open it up to questions from the audience.
Thank you. Thanks so much for being here. That was super interesting. I had a bit of a question. So all the modeling are around kind of high emission scenarios. And in my understanding, it's unlikely we'll reach kind of like that level of emissions if we kind of continue on the current trajectory in terms of policy. So I'm just wondering kind of about the political argument, but even if that's the case, that doesn't mean that there won't be huge effect and those will be disproportionately impacting marginalized communities. So I'm just wondering in terms of like a political argument and that short-term impact, how do you think that's best made if there is like a pushback on, oh, but it won't be that bad, like this kind of thing. And there might be more like a mitigation argument because it sounds like it still will be very important, obviously, to have those effects. But I'm just wondering for that like political perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the paper itself, we actually looked at results for a low emission scenario as well. And I went through it pretty quickly, but like if you had low emission scenario, it would reduce the total number of facilities by like 300. So it's still a big problem. And so even if there are debates about the extent to which the worst case scenario is likely to happen, even if you do the range, we still have big issues. And the equity analyses also were robust.
Hi, thank you so much. This was super interesting. I previously worked as a contractor with CDC doing a lot of maternal health and maternal mortality, so I really appreciated your perspective on preterm birth. I was wondering, I think as a former comms professional, I tend to look at this in terms of what I can communicate to others and how I can use it for implementation. But I'm kind of, I've been sort of percolating on this idea that for whatever reason, climate stuff does not seem to be as sticky as other issues in people's brains. It's something that they go, it'll be something we can worry about in 2100 as opposed to right now. We see images of the polar ice caps are melting, and that hasn't really spurred huge action. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on effective measures on sort of communicating the urgency of these issues and getting people to care and really invest themselves into finding solutions that will work as opposed to just leaving it up to the professionals.
Yeah, such a great question and something that I grapple with as well when I'm trying to do translation work and talk to decision makers. One of the strengths of this project is collaboration with organizations that do that community-based work of people who are feeling directly affected and want to do something. I think some of the visualization work, the climate vision is an attempt to get people to see like this is what we're talking about, and it's actually not that far away. And I think the other thing that is important is, we don't necessarily have to always talk about it in terms of climate change. I mean, so many people have experienced extreme weather events now, whether that's heat waves or flooding events or major storms. And just talking about how those are increasing in intensity, duration, and frequency most people, regardless of whether they think climate change is something we have to worry about in the future, understand what you're talking about when you talk about it in those terms. So I think we just have to be nimble in terms of how we frame like what these data mean and tell the stories that sort of put this into context so that people realize, oh yeah, I have felt this. Like, in where I lived, I had, multiple, I can see the cliffs, already starting to degrade in where I live, and it's only a matter of time before my neighbor's probably going to have to leave their home. Or, I've had, 4 major wildfires that have forced evacuation. So I just think like really trying to connect where people are at and tell those stories and elevate it into making the linkages to why these data are relevant and important.
Rachel, can I follow up on this? Because I'd like to learn a little bit more about the development of the web tool.
Yeah.
So you've got this fantastic interface.
Yeah.
You partnered with, I don't know, it seemed like a dozen or more community groups for this project.
Yeah.
Describe a little bit more for us, sort of like as you're developing this, who you're envisioning was the audience.
Yeah.
And clearly, one can see the intent when you've got the web tool available in multiple languages. Share with us a little bit about who you've learned in practice has been the audience. Were there any surprises you've learned about who's using this tool?
Yeah.
Because we're seeing more and more of this as a way of trying to take our scholarship and make it digestible and actionable by those in the public or key decision makers. We'd love to hear a little bit more about your process, both in developing and its use in practice.
Yeah. So I feel like development of data tools is becoming much more ubiquitous. That a lot of us, we publish in the literature, we realize it's only going to be read by our colleagues, and we want to put stuff out there and just make it available to people. Also, in the interest of research transparency, we want to share data where we can and enable other people to analyze it and that kind of thing. So 2 things related to your question. One is, with the organizations that we worked with, we started from scratch and wrote the grant together. And then, and we agreed that this tool had to be a name. And then when we started to develop the tool, it was a very iterative process. So, a lot of ground truthing, a lot of like how to, categorizing the facilities appropriately. And making sure that the interface was accessible. So we did a lot of like sending people our people links and having them run through it and then having them give us feedback and running workshops, things like that. I think the way I've used tools in general, not just this one's newer, but in past, so we've done like drinking water tools for California to identify places that are at risk of drinking water contaminants, not just people on systems, but domestic well users. And then we developed an early version of, for the California Air Resources Board several years ago, an environmental justice screening method. And we developed these tools as proofs of concept. And the goal of that is to show agencies, you can do this. You can adopt this thing. And so with the environmental justice screening method, we were identifying communities that had cumulative impacts from both structural factors as well as environmental hazards, showing how you could map and accumulate these and score them. And then legislation passed in California that required that 35% of cap and trade proceeds in California were invested in so-called disadvantaged communities. So all of a sudden, there was a need to identify those disadvantaged communities. And initially the bill was, they were going to put our environmental, they said you have to use this screening tool. And I was like, oh no, I'm not going to feed this thing in perpetuity, but we can help Cal EPA, work on this. So basically, Cal EPA's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment created what we now know as Cal EnviroScreen, which in many ways was a precursor for the Biden administration's climate and economic justice screening tools. So I think that's the dual strategy. And when you get an agency actually adopt it, even though they make different decisions and they might score differently, like that's great. That's the goal too.
Thank you, Rachel. This is great. I'm David Cash. I'm the director of the Climate Action Accelerator, and I want to keep on this thread because it's a fascinating thread, and we're all struggling with how we have university-based research have an impact outside. So to keep down this path, clearly the development of this tool, you have the audiences that you've talked about, but you also have other audiences, the industry, who will be impacted potentially by decisions based on this tool,
Yep.
who may or may not trust, believe, or communicate what you're saying in a way that advances the goals that you have. So how, again, a process question, how do you and your team go about maintaining the credibility of the underlying scientific research that you're doing while staying salient to all of the different communities, some who may be quite opposed to one another? Like think of like zoning fights are some of the most difficult and politically charged fights that you can find. So how do you maintain that so that anybody who picks up the web tool can use it as a basis for then the political arguments and arguments about allocation that might happen, but not about whether your tool is a credible tool?
Yeah. Well, I think the key is whenever you release these things, you want to publish your analysis in a credible journal where it's been peer reviewed. And I've, in all of my community academic collaborations related to that, like we talk about the risks and benefits of undertaking this work, because as we all know, data work in mysterious ways. Sometimes data will not necessarily validate community wisdom on a key question. And so before we even start applying for the money and doing the work, we assess the risks and benefits of undertaking such work. And we also assess the extent to which new studies are needed or whether there's enough evidence out there. You know, is it really worth organizations investing more time to generate more science if in fact there's enough already out there to move the needle on policy? And yeah, I mean, so you want to make everyone. It's never been a debate within our community academic collaborators about the need for peer review of our work. And now increasingly, because journals themselves require us to share our data as much as we possibly can, it's not necessarily even a choice anymore, really. And so you want to, and the goal is to make something accessible and usable by myriad audiences, which means a lot of trial and error. And then you do get some surprises, like, you know, we got a lot of calls from city managers when we release this thing. And then we got calls from communities that we didn't even know were organizing around land use redevelopment of, you know, formerly toxic sites and the extent to which this information was helpful, and then gave them the resources they needed to study these sites further to decide what would be an appropriate reuse of the land. So I don't know if I totally answered your question, but you know, and then the reality is you put your data out there, you don't necessarily have control about how people use it once you share it out there. I mean, we haven't had major problems yet, but yes, I think that scenario that you described could happen. Yeah.
Thanks, Rachel. My question was similar to David's, but let me ask you to elaborate more, because I think some of this information is material to stakeholders' risk, right? Risk for climate change impacts on companies,
Yeah.
lending institutions, and I could think insurance.
Yep.
Right. Have you have evidence that you gave examples of city managers, towns, and community groups, but what about the private sector? Do you know they played into this or not?
Yeah, they do. And interestingly enough, well, people may already know this. I mean, there are now a lot of great resources for flooding maps that are proprietary. And Zillow was sharing a lot of that information until recently. So that definitely gets at your question. Like people who were considering buying or renting somewhere could see what the flood risks were, and all of a sudden, boom! Like happened like 6 months ago, I believe, where that it's not, they don't make it available anymore. So yeah, I think that is a huge kind of unknown, although I think the insurance industry already knows the answer to a lot of these questions because they have even better data sometimes than than is publicly available to people like us, or we're forced to kind of reinvent the wheel when we know that a lot of that proprietary data is something that would be more widely available if we could access it.
Have litigators started to use this?
I don't know. Actually, it's a really good question. I mean, there has been litigation over housing redevelopment projects, but I don't know the extent to which I don't think these issues they're definitely have been they're on the list, but they aren't necessarily at the top of the list of what's being litigated.
Hi, Rachel. Very nice talk. Very interesting. Thank you for that. I'm visiting professor from Madrid's university, and I'm curious about whether these community resilience centers in California are still ongoing, or maybe the funding has been already cut off, or if you know anything about that. Because when I was last at UCLA in 2023, there was a bunch of money, resources just coming to these community resilience centers. So just wondering.
So yeah, definitely. A lot of these initiatives have suffered the effects of federal funding cutbacks. They had a lot of great money from the Biden administration to start working on these issues, and then a lot of that was clawed back. Although some of that money is still out there, but we're fortunate in California in that I'm not going to say that they have completely filled the gap, but there's a lot of resources in California that are still accessible to fund a lot of these initiatives, albeit at a lower level. Right now, we're considering legislation to create a research fund to help fill the gap in research more generally in California, which I think will also hopefully open the gates to more funding for more climate resilience and related research in the state. Even though, again, I don't think it'll completely backfill the federal funding, but it'll make it a lot less painful.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question around the same vein. If I looked at your charts, Louisiana is far and away one of the worst impacted states.
Yeah.
This is a state that has voted Republican almost every time. There was a sociologist at your university, and I just am having a senior moment, can't remember the name, who wrote a terrific book. And she went down to Louisiana and lived with several people in communities that live next to these industrial sites.
Yeah.
And these were people whose family members, some of them had died of cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And they universally hated EPA, hated environmental regulation, and were totally opposed to all the things that you're espousing. Why is that happening, and what can we do to reach that group and to begin to change them? Because they're the ones that are being impacted, and they don't seem to, they seem to go the other way on a lot of these issues.
Yeah. Well, I would say that I haven't written a book on Cancer Alley, for example. A lot's been written about it. I would argue that yes, that the communities are divided in terms of how they feel about these industrial complexes. There are people who are organizing to try and get them better regulated, or in some cases to get them shut down. And then there are other people that feel that there are economic benefits that they don't want to lose. Some of that also, and this happens actually in Richmond, California, too, around the Chevron oil refinery, for example. There are divisions between labor and environmental justice groups. And in some cases, I think, at least in Richmond, there's been a little bit more meeting of the minds in terms of how to address the localized impacts of an oil refinery that's been there for over 100 years, that has given a ton of money to the city, that has unionized jobs, and yet everybody knows at some point that refinery is going to be shutting down, whether it does it on its own or because it no longer becomes profitable because of policy change. And so while they haven't necessarily resolved what to do about the future of the facility, they are starting to have a meeting of the minds about what would a transition look like, because both sides agree that eventually that place is going to shut down. There's going to be a toxic site in its wake. We need to think about economic opportunities in the interim and start building that now, so that when the refinery shuts, it's not as devastating for people in terms of who are working in the oil industry to transition. So I would argue that there's more divisions within communities, particularly like in Cancer Alley. That's what I've seen in terms of when I've met with people down there. And in places where communities can see the writing on the wall that some of these industries are going to start to close down, at least coming together to visualize what the future can look like in terms of new economic opportunities as the fossil fuel industry starts to wind down.
I'm tempted to respond for a moment on the Louisiana question, and it's because you talked in terms of politics. So until fairly recently, Black people there didn't vote, and when many weren't allowed to, even after the Voting Rights Acts were passed. So the siting, which goes back, really a century, there was no say in Black communities about what would happen. And the other part is, even in the Black communities that have pushed back, a lot of people have jobs at those plants. And the bosses are not subtle about saying, hey, if you're going to march with those folks, you need to think about another job. And there aren't other jobs. So that's part of why you say a deep red Louisiana, which is, by the way, just completely in the arms of the fossil fuel industry, not wanting to look at some of the reality. But what I wanted to ask you about was on some of the capital questions that David and Jack raised. How is your data being used with folks looking at tax bases in communities? For example, a while back, Moody's started looking at how you could rate the bonds of a particular community, given that there might be some threat from sea level rise or whatever, which would mean that that community might not, over the long term, be in a position to pay back what they're trying to borrow.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's too early to tell because we just released this tool like at the end of last year. So all I can say is stay tuned because I think it's an important thing to try and track and see the extent to which these data are having any impact on those types of decisions. But it's a little early because it literally came out at the end of November.
But as you said, the private side, like the insurance reinsurance, folks like Moody's are already looking.
Yes, they are. And I think, cities and communities are grappling with the potential tax implications of these climate realities. And I think that's sometimes why data are hard to get. And it's only available in the private sector because it's making it, insurance companies and realtors are using that data to make a lot of decisions, but it's not as easily available to consumers to also make wise decisions that are financially beneficial to them. So this is an attempt to try and equalize the playing field a little bit. Voters too, yeah.
Time for one more question.
Thank you for this talk. Just a small question. I wonder if we can quantify the microeconomic impacts of this sea level rise related risks, because you have facilities, ports, and infrastructures in your database, and like facilities, infrastructure can contribute to local economy, and if they are at risk, there would be economic loss in those sites. And also ports also relates to the international trade, like international shipping, and this impacts on the port related infrastructure may impact on international shipping and related economic benefits. I wonder if we could quantify this using your database. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think more work needs to be done to do that. What we have, the next step for some of the analyses that we're doing is trying to quantify the economic benefits of these scenarios of power plant retirements related to health benefits. So that's sort of the direction that we've been going in terms of quantifying the economic benefits of the health improvements, but we have not ventured into the type of analysis that you described, which I think would be important to also undertake.
So before we wrap up, let me know we'll meet again next Monday here in Rubenstein 414 with Christian Capps of Harvard Business School. Professor Capps will speak on the electric vehicle transition. Finally, please join me in thanking Professor Rachel Morello-Frosch for her insights and expertise here today. This is great.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Great.